Hi, class, and welcome to our first lecture of Psych 2 Biological Psychology. My name is Dr. Gavin Shaffron. I am a New York State licensed clinical psychologist and also professor, and I will be the instructor for your course. Hopefully, by this time, you've already reviewed the syllabus and the course requirements. If you have not yet done so, I strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with the lecture. Get a sense of what our course requirements are, the requirements for weekly discussion posts, and the exam requirements as well. But without further ado, let's get started. A little bit about me. So, before we dive into the course materials, I think it's always helpful to have a bit of an introduction. I ask all of you to do that as well in the form of our first discussion post to get to know each other a little bit. Um, but I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in the San Fernando Valley, and I'm a proud alumni of LA Pierce College. After Pierce, I transferred to UCLA and then moved on to complete my master's in psychology and education and clinical psychology at Columbia University. From there, I completed my PhD in clinical psychology at the California School of Professional Psychology at Alliant International University in San Francisco. And I wrapped up my education with specialized trainings at UCSF, Stanford, and Harvard Medical School. In addition to teaching, like I said before, I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist, and I have a full-time private psychotherapy practice as well. So that's a little bit about me. As you can see, there is life after community college, but community college is near and dear to my heart. It's why I continue to teach in the community college system, is because it gave me my start and because I love teaching. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's have a little bit of an introduction to the topic. So as you start listening to our first lecture, I want you all to take a couple of deep breaths. Breathing typically happens automatically and without your awareness, but you can easily control your body to take a deep breath. Now point your attention to your expanding chest, the feeling of air flowing past your lips, the sound of your deep breath. After a few mindful breaths, you might feel more relaxed or in your body, so to speak. After a few months of regularly attending to your breath, as is done in meditation practices, you might notice improved attentional control, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. And this actually might change the physiological and physical structure of your brain. So this all is kind of strange, isn't it? And it kind of leads to the questions of, how can some bodily functions be maintained automatically without awareness, but can be controlled under your own volition? Why are we typically unaware of sensations that are constant, but we can direct our attention to consciously perceive them? Why do we even have subjective experience? Or from an evolutionary perspective, did having subjective experience help humans survive and pass on their genes? Who, what, where is the self? So who experienced this? There are no little characters pulling levers in your head like the Disney movie Inside Out. So how is this taking shape? And how can awareness of a few deep breaths change your emotional state? So, when we think about this, the other question is, how can regularly performing an activity change the structure of your brain? Well, the answers to all these questions relate to the brain. And experience, awareness, the feeling of self, and in fact, all of your thoughts, perceptions, movements, and emotions emerge from the pattern of electrochemical signals zipping across the 86 billion neurons of your brain. The human brain is the most complex object that we know of in the universe. Each neuron is as complex as a major city, and connects with thousands of other neurons, resulting in 300 million neuronal connections in a single cubic millimeter of the brain. And that's the size of the tip of a ballpoint pen. So scaling that up, the entire brain is about 1,200 cubic centimeters and weighs about 3 pounds. And in that 3 pounds, it contains about 60 trillion synaptic connections and essentially an infinite possible pattern of activation. These patterns of brain activation make you, you. And we're still learning about the brain, and many mysteries definitely remain. But scientists know an astounding amount about how the brain works. And in recent decades, researchers have gained major insights into the brain's molecular and chemical processes, into neuronal communication, and the functions of specific brain areas and networks. We've advanced our understanding of how drugs and hormones affect brain function, how genes and environment shapes brain and behavior, and as well, how the brain develops and can deteriorate with damage, disease, or psychological disorders. And we're going to explore all of these topics and more in this course on biological psychology. So before we continue, take a look at this. This is, well, us. It's an MRI image of networks of our axonal nerve fibers within the brain as seen through the viewpoint of magnetic resonance imaging. It's quite a sight, isn't it? So as we contemplate the vastness of the neural networks that make up who we are, let's consider what this topic is really about. Let's give ourselves a working definition. What is biological psychology? Well, biological psychology is the scientific study that links brain and behavior. Biological psychology, or psychobio, or biopsych for short, is related to neighboring disciplines, including behavioral neuroscience. The distinction is subtle, but we use the term biological psychology here because it emphasizes the centrality of psychology, the science of mental processes and behavior. Our goal is to understand the biological bases of psychology rather than psychological aspects of biology or neuroscience. Thus, biological psychology investigates how biological factors like the brain, the nervous system, hormones, and genes influence our cognition, our emotions, our motivations, our memories, and our actions. Biological psychology is not only a scientific discipline, but also a viewpoint that emphasizes that brain mechanisms underlie all of our thoughts and actions, and that these brain mechanisms have evolved over eons from our ancient ancestors who survived and reproduced. Now, when we think about the history of biological psychology, thinkers have long mused about the nature of human behavior and experience. But the scientific discipline of biological psychology has roots in physiology, philosophy, and the early psychologists who adopted empiricism in the 19th century. Wilhelm Wundt, considered the founder of experimental psychology, started the first psychology laboratory in the 1870s in Germany, where his research emphasized systematic observations to understand conscious and mental processes. In the Principles of Psychology, William James in 1890 argued that the scientific study of psychology should be grounded in an understanding of biology. Now, although we can't pin down the exact start of the field of biological psychology, the publication of Donald Hebb's groundbreaking book, The Organization of Behavior in 1949, marked a defining moment for it. Hebb proposed the first brain-based account of how psychological phenomena like perception, thought, and memory could emerge from brain activity and thereby challenge the prevailing view that psychological phenomena were too complex to originate from brain processes. So nowadays, biological psychology is a broad and diverse field that consists of many different approaches to studying links between the brain and behavior. So here are some major branches of biological psychology. We have psychopharmacology, which examines how drugs and other substances affect the brain and behavior, as well as how they can be used to treat psychological disorders. We have neuropsychology, which investigates the relationship between brain function and behavior, focusing on how brain damage or dysfunction can impact cognitive and psychological functioning, especially in human patients. Psychophysiology studies the relation between physical functions of organisms, so physiology, and psychological processes. Common psychological measures include the electroencephalogram, or EEG, heart rate, and pupil dilation to assess this. We also have psychoneuroimmunology, and if you've taken my Psych 1, you've no doubt heard about this before. It examines the relationship between the nervous system, immune system, and hormones and behavior. Psychoneuroimmunologists often study the impact of stress and stress hormones on illness susceptibility and recovery, as well as illness development and trajectory. Evolutionary psychology explores how human evolutionary processes like natural selection have adaptively shaped human traits and behaviors. Behavioral genetics analyzes how genetic factors contribute to individual differences in behavior, cognition, personality, etc., and how genetic factors interact with environmental influences as well. Cognitive neuroscience studies the neural basis of human cognitive processes, including perception, attention, memory, language, and decision-making. It often uses tools like fMRIs, or functional magnetic brain imaging. And comparative psychology examines the behavioral and mental processes of non-human animals to gain insight into the evolutionary and environmental factors that shape animal and human behavior and mental processes. Now, biological psychology can be parsed into even more subfields. The subfields overlap, and researchers often work in more than one area. But this list that I just gave you here on this slide shows the breadth of approaches used to study the links between the brain and behavior. And biological psychology is highly interdisciplinary, and researchers may have trained in psychology, neuroscience, biology, computer science, medicine, philosophy, or even engineering. Each discipline contributes to a different approach and understanding to the brain and its functions, but also poses new questions and problems that require collaboration and integration. Understanding and integrating knowledge from various subfields can be challenging for both students and researchers, but that integration provides a richer understanding of the brain and leads to breakthroughs that propel scientific progress. So, one of the things to keep in mind when we think about the interdisciplinary nature of biological psychology is that biological psychology uses many techniques to observe, measure, and manipulate the brain, but researchers across all fields use the same underlying approach: science and the scientific method. The scientific method is a systematic way of gathering and testing evidence based on observation and experimentation. The scientific process usually starts with an observation or question that one wants to understand. A researcher proposes a tentative explanation called a hypothesis to explain the phenomena. A valid hypothesis must be testable. It should also be falsifiable, meaning that the experimental results can disprove it. Importantly, science does not claim to prove anything. If you took my research methods class, you've heard me say this ad nauseum. And this is because scientific understandings are always subject to modification with further information. This step, openness to disproving ideas, distinguishes science from non-science. The presence of the supernatural, for instance, is neither testable nor falsifiable. A hypothesis should also fit into the context of a scientific theory, a broad explanation for some aspect of the natural world that's consistently supported by evidence over time. A theory is the best understanding we have of that part of the natural world. The researcher can then test the validity of the hypothesis by making observations or carrying out an experiment. An experiment will have one or more variables and one or more controls. A variable is any part of the experiment that can vary or change during the experiment. And an independent variable is the one that is manipulated by the researcher, while a dependent variable is the outcome variable that's measured. The control group contains every feature of the experimental group except that experimental manipulation from the researcher's hypothesis. Therefore, if the results from the experimental group differ from the control group, that difference must be due to the hypothesized manipulation rather than some outside factor. For example, if a researcher hypothesizes that a certain drug decreases appetite, they could perform an experiment with the independent manipulated variable of drug or no drug, and the dependent measured variable amount of food eaten. The researcher would randomly assign some participants to the experimental group who gets the drug, and other participants to the control group who gets a placebo pill that looks like the drug. Through random assignment and proper control conditions, only the drug would differ between the experimental and control group. And if the experimental drug group eats less than the control placebo group, then one could conclude that the hypothesis is supported. Conversely, the research could lead to rejecting the hypothesis if it's not supported by the experimental data. So after analyzing their data, researchers communicate their results and conclusions in publications or presentations so that others can critique, replicate, or build on the results. In addition to publishing a report, researchers now regularly publish their data sets so that others can reanalyze their data to ensure quality and maybe find something new without having to collect new data. Study results inform future studies, so this can help to refine hypotheses. Experimental outcomes can prompt shifts in approach or spark new research questions, and many times science does not operate in a linear fashion. Instead, scientists continually draw inferences and make generalizations, finding patterns as their research proceeds. Science and the scientific method are the best ways to understand and study the brain because they provide us with rigorous, objective, and verifiable knowledge that can help us improve our health, our education, and our well-being. So this brings us to basic versus applied research. And across the various subfields of biological psychology, research really can be categorized as either basic or applied. Basic research, also known as pure research, is driven by scientific curiosity or an interest in understanding the mechanisms of brain function and brain behavior relationships. It seeks to answer fundamental questions about how the brain works and explores the biological bases of behavior, emotions, and cognitive processes by examining genetics, neurotransmission, brain circuitry, and other physiological processes. On the other hand, applied research in biological psychology takes findings from basic research and uses them to solve real-world issues. Examples of applied research include developing therapeutic interventions for medical or mental disorders, devising strategies for optimizing learning and memory, or creating neurofeedback methods for stress reduction. While the two types of research may seem distinct, they're interdependent. Basic research lays the groundwork for the applications that emerge from applied research, and applied research often raises new questions that drive basic research. In public and political debates, people sometimes argue for cutting funding for basic science because they contend it has no practical value. However, basic science works in synergy with applied science. Together, they're both essential to the development of biological psychology and science more broadly. Biological psychology and related neuroscience fields are highly active areas of research. Billions of dollars are invested annually, and tens of thousands of researchers study the brain and behavior. The vast endeavor to understand the brain will help unravel the mysteries of human nature and our human experience. Brain research also has impactful applications. It helps to heal brain damage and psychological disorders. It guides the development of AI and brain-compatible social policies. Now, brain damage and psychological disorders affect tens of millions of people each year. And brain science enhances patient care and treatment. Research on cellular and molecular mechanisms in the brain can lead to new drugs, ways to regrow neurons, and increased neural plasticity. All these terms you're going to learn about as the course goes on. Researchers have developed groundbreaking new technology like transcranial magnetic stimulation that stimulates the brain with magnetic pulses and can treat otherwise treatment-resistant depression, or deep brain stimulation that uses brain implants to treat diseases like Parkinson's. Brain-computer interfaces pick up brain signals and analyze them and translate them into commands for devices like wheelchairs or robotic arms. These can help people regain movements who have neuromuscular disorders like ALS, a spinal cord injury, or a stroke. Now, when we talk about brain-compatible social policies, brain science can also have payoffs in guiding these social policies. For example, psychology and neuroscience research has implications for how we view and address drug addiction. Advances in psychopharmacology and neuroscience reveal that addiction is driven by brain processes. As a result, policies that attack only drug supply are typically unsuccessful. If one point of supply is busted, another will pop up soon because the demand remains. Instead, policies should focus on attacking the demand for drugs. Treatments rooted in disrupting the brain circuits driving addiction will be more effective than an incarceration-focused approach. Finally, a large portion of the prison population in the US is mentally ill. The prevalence of serious mental illness in jail inmates is around 15% for men and 31% for women. Jails and prisons have become mental health care facilities. For example, the Rikers Island prison is New York's largest mental institution. And more mentally ill persons are in jail and prisons than are in hospitals. Brain science demonstrates that psychological disorders are rooted in the brain. So one has to ask whether policies that support and treat those with mental health problems might keep them from committing crimes in the first place, and whether a treatment approach could be more humane and more cost-effective. So to understand the human brain and human psychology, ideally, we would only study humans. But some research just can't be conducted with humans. So Psychobio researchers also perform research with animals, unfortunately. Most psychological research using animals is now conducted with rats, mice, and birds, as the use of other animals such as non-human primates is declining. Now, like research with humans, all research plans with animals must be reviewed by an ethics board to ensure that they meet important ethical principles, such as use animals in research only if there is a reasonable expectation that the research will provide some benefits, such as increasing understanding of the structure and processes underlying behavior, or benefiting the health and welfare of humans and other animals. Use a procedure that subjects animals to pain or stress only if alternative procedures are not available and the research goals are justified by its prospective scientific, educational, or applied value, and make every effort to minimize discomfort, illness, and pain of the animals. Now, people naturally disagree about the practice of using animals in research. I shudder at it myself. Although many people accept the value of such research, a minority of people, including some animal rights activists, understandably believe that it's ethically wrong to conduct research on animals because animals are living creatures just like humans are. And so no harm should be done to them. Now, most scientists, however, argue that such beliefs ignore the benefits that could come from animal research. For instance, drugs to prevent or treat polio, diabetes, smallpox, cancer, or Alzheimer's disease may be first tested on animals. And surgery that can save human lives may first be practiced on animals. Research on animals has also led to better understanding of the physiological causes of depression, phobias, stress, among other illnesses. Many scientists believe that because there are many possible benefits from animal research, such research should continue as long as the animals are treated humanely and ethical principles mentioned previously are met. The animal research debate is complex and not a simple yes or no issue. But animal rights advocacy has improved lab animal welfare conditions and reduced lab animal suffering. Now, while biological psychology is diverse in the approaches to study the brain, historically, the people involved in the research have not been especially diverse. Most early research was done by men of European descent due to the social and cultural factors, systemic barriers, and unconscious biases that were present in the field and in culture at the time that the research was being done. The field has been getting more diverse in the last decades, and many leading labs are headed by women and historically underrepresented minorities. Diversity, both across and within labs, contributes to better quality of science. If everyone has the same background and viewpoint, innovation lags because novel ideas are generated less often, and new ideas may be derided and viewed as dissenting. Unique perspectives advance science, and research shows that more diverse groups outperform less diverse groups in many settings. Diversity in science can be increased with policies and programs that address bias, harassment, mentorship, work-life balance, and educational and training opportunities so that all have equal opportunities to succeed. National academies of science, engineers, and medicine really reinforced that in their 2023 study. Another area lacking diversity in biological psychology is in the research subjects that are selected. The vast majority of research subjects in psychology studies, 96% by one estimate, were from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic WEIRD societies. These WEIRD societies represent a very narrow slice of humankind, and research findings from them don't necessarily generalize to populations everywhere or serve the goal of understanding human psychology in all settings. Likewise, most participants in mental health studies, such as those looking at genetic risk and psychiatric disorders, have been of European ancestry. It is unclear how those studies benefit people of differing ethnicities who may have different mental health needs and respond differently to treatments based on their evolutionarily created differences in physiological adaptation. Research on diverse populations is therefore crucial considering the long-standing disparities in mental health care for individuals from racial and ethnic minority groups, those with lower socioeconomic status, and residents of rural areas who are more likely to receive lower quality mental health care. Funding agencies, including NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, are increasingly paying attention to the importance of including people from diverse backgrounds when developing funding mechanisms and reviewing grant proposals, which ultimately shapes the direction of science. So in summary, biological psychology benefits from researchers and participants with different backgrounds to enrich the quality and creativity of science and make the findings and field more relevant and applicable for all people. So finally, as we look ahead to the following lectures of this course, it consists of largely 12 major sections. Just looking at the road ahead, we're going to be covering foundations of biological psychology like brain anatomy, neurons, and research methods in more detail. We continue on to higher level topics that link biology and psychology, such as how drugs and hormones affect the brain and behavior, brain development, memory, genetics, and emotions. And we conclude with how things can go wrong in the brain, such as brain damage, neurological diseases, and psychological disorders. So key topic areas include the brain and nervous system, the central and peripheral organization, the major brain regions, and key terms associated with them. Neurons, the structure and electrochemical communication system and sensory processing behavior. Like I mentioned before, and like we touched on today, research methods from brain damage cases to EEG, fMRI, PET scans, transcranial magnetic stimulation, optogenics, and animal studies. We also touch on psychopharmacology, like psychoactive drugs such as caffeine and alcohol, neurotransmitters, how they work, and psychiatric treatments, how they work. We look at hormones, sex, and gender, endocrine influences on behavior, biological sex, brain differences, gender and diversity, and how that all plays in. We look at development of the human body and the human brain, from the neural tube all the way to adulthood. We look at neuroplasticity at sensitive periods and critical periods of development and changes over the lifespan. We also look at learning and memory, types of memory. The hippocampus, we look at the example of patient HM, which you might remember from your intro psych classes. We look at sleep and consolidation and disorders and strategies that affect learning and memory. We also look at genetics and epigenetics, nature versus nurture, gene by environment interactions, and epigenetic regulation. We look at emotion and affective neuroscience, at brain networks and neurotransmitters that underlie basic emotions. We look at brain damage and disease, at strokes, tumors, traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and multiple sclerosis. And finally, like I mentioned, biological disorders, the biological bases of schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, and anxiety, OCD, PTSD, and treatments. So that does it for this week's lecture. Be sure to respond to the weekly discussion question, both to the question prompt and to two of your classmates by the end of the week. And I look forward to getting to know you all on this journey ahead. Take good care.